Farmland Preservation Division in 2012 and became its director in 2022. He holds a Master of Public Administration degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a Master of Project Management degree from Western Carolina University. And he is a North Carolina Certified Public Manager. And we are very happy to have him here talking to us about easements. Thank you so much, Evan.
Thanks, Leslie and Bob. Great to be here. There's got a lot of information in this presentation today. So Bob shared the link for the presentation. Many times when we talk about agricultural conservation easements, questions come up after the presentation. So be sure to reach out afterwards. And of course, any questions that come up today, happy to answer those. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll jump right into it. All right, so I really want to start this presentation by setting the scene. Why are agricultural conservation easements so important in the farmland preservation effort? The American Farmland Trust has released two of the most comprehensive studies in farmland loss in the past few years. A 2020 report looked at farmland loss between 2001 and 2016. They determined that in North Carolina, 732,000 acres of farmland was converted to non-ag uses. That was the second most in the country. They look at how land is being converted. And one of the areas is low density residential development. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But 78% of the land converted during that time period was to low density residential development. And this led the entire nation. In a part of their study, they looked at the quality of the farmland. They have a criteria called nationally significant land. These are lands that would take 2 to 3 times the amount of marginal land to make up for its productivity. They determined that out of that 732,000 acres of farmland loss, 387,000 of which were nationally significant land. So not only are we losing farmland, we're losing some of our most productive land as well. Low density residential development is a sliding scale. And so you can think about these in a number of different ways. Most commonly, these are going to be individual houses or housing clusters along the suburban fringe and along rural roads. It also can be large lot housing where previously larger tracts are cut down into bigger tracts, but not quite big enough to be an agricultural operation. The aerial photography on the slide is from southern Wake County. You can see the dichotomy between that subdivision and the agricultural land right beside it. I'm sure you can guess what that land used to be, where the subdivision now stands. Based on their study, they identified the areas of farmland loss. They have really good mapping tools for these studies. This is just the static of the entire state. The areas in red are the areas they identified as being converted from ag land to non-ag uses. They came out with a second part of their study in 2022. This looked at farmland loss projections out to the year 2040. And once again, North Carolina was ranked number 2. They projected that North Carolina would lose the second most number of acres between 2022 and 2024. They had 3 models in their report. One was called business as usual. This looked at current development trends and how much land would be converted. In that model, they projected nearly 1.2 million acres of farmland to be lost by the year 2040. The second model was called runaway sprawl. In this model, they increased the amount of low density residential development by 50%. In this model, the number of farmland acres lost bumps up to 1.6 million acres. And then they had a third model. This was the preferred model called better built cities. This reduced the amount of low density residential development by half. The idea was reducing sprawl, building more towards areas that are already developed. It's still not a good number, but it's better than the other two. In that model, over 660,000 acres converted from non-ag uses. This report got down to the county level, which is very informative. and it shed a lot of light on which areas are experiencing that growth. Now, there are over 34,000 counties or county equivalents across the United States. And so in this report, North Carolina had 4 counties that were in the top 40 of all the counties in the United States. Johnston County ranked 19th in the nation for potential farmland loss, Union 23rd, Wake 32nd, and Iredell 38th. They also looked at percentage that could be lost. So not looking at the whole number of acres, but rather how much ag land is left and how much would be lost based on a percentage. In that report, North Carolina ranked 6th in the nation. However, we were the first state that was not located in the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic. So again, significant projections on farmland loss, whether you're looking at whole numbers or percentages. Now, based on that business as usual model, here's the economic impact of losing 1.1 million acres. That's 9,100 farms lost, a reduction in economic output of $1.25 billion, and nearly 20,000 jobs lost, both in the farm and agribusiness sector. Now, sometimes it might be hard to wrap your head around what we're talking about in this size, these millions of acres. So if you look at the runaway sprawl model, it says 1.6 million acres of farmland to be lost. The entire size of the state of Delaware is 1.5 million acres. So here in this next slide, we've got a true projection of both our states. So there's the state of Delaware, true size compared to North Carolina. I show you this just to put those numbers with a graphic. Visual learners might be might help seeing this on the screen, but it really is jarring when you think about what we could lose. Again, mapping tools are great. Here are the areas they project to be converted. And a lot of areas make a lot of sense. They're around the urban areas, the growing suburban areas, but you'd be hard to not find a red area anywhere across the state from Murphy to Manio. All right, so that's what's at stake. So what are we doing about it? Inside the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, we have a Farmland Preservation Division. The mission is in the name. We want to help preserve working farms and forests across North Carolina. The primary program inside the Farmland Preservation Division is the Agricultural Development and Farmland Preservation Trust Fund. This is a grant-making entity. We provide grants for conservation easements, which we'll talk about in depth today. We also provide grants for other things to help support the agribusiness sector, county governments. These grants go to county governments or land trusts, and we'll talk about how that works when we deal with private landowners. Our responsibility in the division, we work in every function of the grant-making entity with the trust fund, from application all the way to post-award monitoring. We work with agencies and state government, local government, federal government, universities, nonprofits to help build these strategies for farmland preservation. And then, like I just mentioned, we work with counties on their specific programs to help farmland preservation. So let's take a look at some of the tools available for farmland preservation. This is a great graphic because it demonstrates the hierarchy of farmland preservation. As you move up the pyramid, you increase the protection for the land, and you also increase the financial incentives for the landowners. So at the very base of the pyramid, we have the Voluntary Agricultural Districts Program. 90 out of the 100 counties in North Carolina have a VAD ordinance. It is the first step for anyone interested in farmland preservation. It's a great program with benefits like record notice, public hearings, an agricultural advisory board. Landowners can sign up with little to no fee, and they can withdraw from the program with no fees or penalties. Again, we're going to talk about the very top of the pyramid today with conservation easements. Now, I do want to preface this by saying that there are all different types of conservation easements. They have different purposes. We're going to be talking about agricultural conservation easements because that is the primary purpose of these easements. It's a voluntary legal tool that restricts residential, commercial, and industrial development of the land in order to maintain its agricultural production capability. As I mentioned, we provide grants for conservation easements. Most of the grants we provide are for conservation easements. Over 90% of our grant funds go towards this type of program. These funds go towards the purchase of development rights. We'll be talking about that quite a bit during the presentation today. It also covers the costs that are involved with building the conservation easement package and recording the conservation easement. It's important to note that if a grant is awarded where there is the compensation for the easement purchase, landowners will be compensated for a portion of those development rights. We'll go through how all that is structured here in a few slides. One of the most important concepts with this program is that all the land remains in private ownership. We are not doing anything in fee simple. We're not doing anything with public land. We're not doing anything with land transfers, no condemnations. This is a voluntary program and the easements remain in private ownership. We're looking at one specific property right, and that is the development rights of the property. Another very important concept is that these easements run with the land. If you saw the top of the pyramid, perpetual conservation easements are the best tool for farmland preservation. It's also the most common tool when we talk about conservation easements. So it's important to understand that the easement runs with the land, and so the next owners, whether the property is sold, transferred, or inherited, the easement will go with it. So understanding what the restrictions of these easements are is very important. And here are the primary restrictions. Residential development. If you notice, there's an asterisk at the end of it. We'll talk about why that asterisk is on the next slide. Industrial and commercial development outside of agriculture and customary rural enterprises. So we want to make sure that the construction on the property is compatible with the terms of the easement. So you can't have something like a gas station or a retail establishment. Those would go against the purposes of the easement. Subdivision of the property. This is another very important concept. Once the easement is recorded, it cannot be subdivided. So you cannot parcel it out. The good thing about this program is that you can customize the boundaries of the easement. You can have one easement that covers 3 tax parcels. You can have 3 easements within 1 tax parcel. So there are ways to handle a subdivision situation before recording the easement by having more than 1 easement in the plan. So again, when you're talking with potential heirs of the property or for your business operations, it's important to think about how will the next ownership handle it. And these are things that our division and then our partners at local government or in the land trust community can help you work through that thought process. Impervious surfaces. There's going to be a restriction on the amount of impervious surfaces on the property, which means anything that rainwater cannot penetrate. So rooftops, paved roads. Generally speaking, there's a 2% impervious surface limit with these easements. There are some allowances if you have additional buildings that relate to the ag operation, but generally speaking, 2% is the limit. So with a 100-acre easement, you could have up to 2 acres of impervious surfaces on the property. Mining. There's a restriction on mining. We want to preserve the topsoil for the production of food and fiber. Dumping and trash, of course, those environmental concerns. Commercial signage, there's restrictions on billboards. And then we're talking about our military partnerships today as well. So the military can work with us on common projects. We work around installations and also in airspace between installations. They want to be able to maintain their training capability and also provide buffers against base encroachment. We can work together because if a land parcel achieves one of their objectives and is also a working farm or forest, we can put those monies together. And we'll talk about how that works a little bit later. All right, so I mentioned that these easements remain in private ownership. So what rights do you retain? You retain the fee simple ownership of the property. That's very important. Along with that, you retain your right to privacy. So these easements do not grant public access to the land. There are different types of conservation easements out there that might focus on trails or outdoor recreation. That's not what these easements do. So there is no public access to the land. You still can enforce your trespass. Right to farm, obviously, that is the primary purpose of the program. It's important to include here because there are some conservation easements that are more restrictive, that may limit your ability to harvest crops or cut trees. These easements do not do that. Timber harvest, like I just mentioned. Right to customary rural enterprises. So most commonly, this is agritourism and ecotourism. Agritourism relates to the agricultural operation. Ecotourism is based on the natural resources on the property. So if you have some type of vegetable or produce stand, if you have a hiking trail, those things are still allowed with this easement. All right, so going back to that asterisk I just spoke about on the previous slide, construction as permitted in the easement language and within farmstead building envelopes. So what this means is we do have allowances for residential development. You have to delineate the areas where you want to construct buildings. These are called farmstead building envelopes. They'll be delineated on the survey, and the specific language will be included in the conservation easement deed. But you do have these allowances. You can have up to 3 residential structures on one easement. And then our recommendation is do not exceed 15% of the property in farmstead building envelopes. Again, you have that counterbalance with the 2% impervious surface limit, but you do have some flexibility on areas you can designate for farmstead building envelopes. Not only is that for residences, but is also for any type of structure that's related to the ag operation. So most commonly that means barns and sheds, but you can also have buildings for agritourism, confined animal operations. It does vary. You can have some great flexibility, but again, these have to be delineated in the survey and included in the easement language. Otherwise, they are not permitted. Low impact, non-developed recreational activities, hunting, fishing, bird watching, hiking, all of that is still allowed, and you do retain your water rights. All right, so what have we done so far? Here's our map. Over 36,000 acres under easement, 242 conservation easements recorded. If you notice, out of the 242, 231 are perpetual. Reason being, the payout for easement purchase is higher with a perpetual easement versus a term easement. A term easement is limited by a set number of years. Also, there are tax incentives available for perpetual conservation easements. There are no tax incentives for term conservation easements. So those 2 reasons are the primary reasons why someone would choose a perpetual conservation easement versus a term conservation easement. And we have completed easements in 54 of the 100 counties in North Carolina. All right, so when we talk with landowners and we explain what the easement is and what it isn't, explain a little bit of the process, the next question that comes up is, well, how much am I going to get paid for this? So here's a breakdown of the conservation easement purchase value since 2016. These are broken down by region. I'll show you the regions on the next slide. The second column gives the average per acre conservation easement purchase value. This means this is the maximum compensation for the purchase of development rights with the easement. And these are based on closed easements. The next 2 columns gives you the low and the high, so you have the range there. So you can see the breakdown of the values. And then here are the regions. These serve a few purposes, but there are differences in obviously the types of agricultural operations from the mountains to the coast. There's different types of development pressures in different regions as well. And one of our mandates through the trust fund is to spread out our funding the best we can across the state. So we use these funding regions as a mechanism to do so. Now, this table here gives you is a good tool to do some napkin math. Because oftentimes we'll get asked, well, what do you think the value of the easement is? And one of our disclaimers is we are not appraisers, and every appraisal is a case by case basis. But these values are based on what we have completed. And here's how this would work. We'll just use easy math. If we had a 100,000 fair market value of the property, and we took the percentage of 40, that would equal 40% after the conservation easement value. So the difference between those two values is the easement purchase value. So in that scenario, the landowner will be looking at a maximum potential compensation for the purchase of the easement of $60,000. So let's look at this another way. Here's another breakdown. The statewide average percentage of fair market value after the easement is 45%. So we'll use a fair market value of $225,000. We'll use that 45%. That gives us the 101,250 on the value after the conservation easement. So again, to determine the easement purchase value, you take the fair market value, subtract by the value after the conservation easement. The difference between those two is the conservation easement purchase value. This is the potential compensation for the landowner. And in this scenario, it's $123,750. All right, so we understand the easement. We know how the values are calculated. What are the funding options? We're talking about our program here with the state. We also have a counterpart program with USDA. There are really two mechanisms for funding for conservation easements through USDA. One is through their general ALE program, Agricultural Land Easements. The other is through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP. These are generally geographically based programs that service a particular area. So in North Carolina, if you're located inside an RCPP funding region, you can apply for those funds specifically for that area. If not, you would go into the statewide ALE application pool. Department of Defense. We'll talk about this more in the next couple slides. But they have a program under the Secretary of the Defense called the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program, called REPI. These are funds that are provided to installations to help achieve these types of objectives that we're talking about today. Protection for training areas, airspace protection, and buffers against installation encroachment. So right now in North Carolina, the Department of Agriculture is working with the U.S. Air Force as part of their training mission to protect airspace, and then also with the United States Marine Corps installations through the Department of the Navy to, again, achieve the same objective of protecting training and airspace areas. Now, one of the best trends in the past couple of years has been the emergence of county programs. There are some counties in North Carolina that help provide additional funds through this program. And so we can match up with their funds just like we do with USDA or the Department of Defense. And then the last piece here is the landowner in-kind donation of value. This is the part that's eligible for the tax incentives. So on the previous slide, we looked at a easement purchase value of $123,000. Through our normal standard appraisal program, we can provide up to half of that. So you always have to finish the equation, so to speak. So where does the remainder of that value come from? If you cannot get it from a cash source, like we just mentioned here with one of these other programs, you have to donate the value. But that's a good thing because that can help offset any type of taxes that may be incurred through this transaction. It's important to remember these are real estate transactions, And because you're being compensated for the purchase development rights, those may be subject to capital gains. All right, so specifically, how do we work with the military? The Sentinel Landscape Program is a federal partnership that looks at areas of strategic importance to the military and how they can work with other agencies to protect those lands. So at the federal level, it's the Department of Defense, USDA, and the Department of Interior. So these areas throughout the country are designated to help support the 5 different missions you see on the slide: strengthen military readiness, conserve natural resources, bolster ag and forestry, increase public access to outdoor recreation, and enhance resiliency to climate change. So in North Carolina, we have the Eastern North Carolina Sentinel Landscape. It was designated as a Sentinel Landscape in 2016. It covers 33 counties in the eastern part of the state, stretching from the sand hills to the coast. It's very large, over 11 million acres. And as you can imagine, it checks all of those boxes that we saw on the mission. There's all types of different land resources that can help bolster the military mission in North Carolina. Here's a map that shows the boundaries of the easement. I'll pause there for just a moment so everybody can take a look and see if your county is represented in the Eastern North Carolina Sentinel Landscape. But as mentioned, there are 7 major installations in the state: Fort Liberty and Camp McCall, Camp Lejeune, Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, Marine Corps Air Station Oak Grove, and the Dare County Range, which is serviced by Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. A few others here. There's some practice ranges and also the Coast Guard Station in Elizabeth City. But as you can see, lots of different natural resources in this region that can be compatible with the military operations from these different installations. So for our program specifically, this is how it works. We have a single conservation easement that can include funding from USDA and then either the Air Force or the Department of Navy for the Marine Corps installations in North Carolina. That's who we work with right now. But because it is a single easement, we can put our funding together, and what that does is help further incentivize landowners to participate. Rather than being capped at 50% from the state, we can get another 50% from the military installation for a potential of 100% cash considerations for the purchase of the conservation easement. Like I mentioned previously, it has to check each of our boxes. It has to be a working farm or forest, and it has to be a strategically placed parcel in their military operating zones. Now, these applications are a little bit different than our standard competitive grant. Our competitive grant through the trust fund is open every fall from mid-October to mid-December. This is on a rolling basis. It's really based on funding availability and then what the priorities of the installation are. So if you are a landowner that's in one of those counties that's in an area that's close to one of the installations or training areas that you saw, you can contact us. You can contact the Foundation for Soil and Water Conservation, or you can contact the Working Lands Trust for more information. How that process generally works: we'll accept your application through the Military Conservation Easement Application Portal, and once it's complete, we'll send it up to the military installations. They will determine whether or not it's in a priority zone for them. If it is, you could be eligible for funding through the program. If not, you can still go through our competitive grant process and be open to those other funding opportunities through USDA or county governments as well. So again, to look at the partnership funding example, I talked about the 50% value. That is the standard for most easement programs. So in this example, if we had a value of $361,000, and really we can supplant either any of these programs on the pie chart here, but for our purposes here, we have the state with us and USDA. Both programs can provide up to 50% in cash considerations for easement purchase. So you have it split 180 and 180. depending on the funding sources, or if a landowner wants to have tax incentives, the cuts of the pie, so to speak, can shift. As long at the end of the day, it equals that 100% value. So in this example, $361,000, you can cut the pie in different ways, depending on funding availability and how your tax situation may play out. All right, so I know we have different groups in here today. This applies for both landowners and folks that might be working with landowners or may receive questions for landowners. Here's how the process works. Landowners have to work with a county government or a land trust. They are the ones that apply for the funds on their behalf. If awarded funds, they're the ones that will receive the grant funds. They will build the conservation easement package. And then once the easement is recorded, the county government or the land trust is the easement holding entity. What that means is, for lack of a better term, they are the enforcers of the terms and conditions of the easements. You remember the restrictions that we talked about previously. The easement holders are the ones that are ensuring that the landowners do not have any type of actions or activities that go against the restrictions of the easement. But you want to think of it more as a cooperative relationship. Because most are perpetual, this is a forever relationship. So cooperation is key when working with these entities. So you have to have one of those partners, and then there has to be some type of agreement between the two entities. They have to have a formal relationship. And then once that formal relationship is established between the landowner and the county government or land trust, then they can go looking for the funding that we just spoke about. So the next two slides have a little bit of a glimpse of who is working on these projects in North Carolina. These are in blue. These are soil and water conservation districts that are easement holders, 17 of those. 3 counties in red are the easement holders. We have 4 counties in green. Those are ones that have an active contract for a conservation easement but have not completed it yet. And then in the last application cycle, we did receive 1 new applicant in Pasquotank County. For land trusts, these are the ones that we are currently working with or have worked with in the past. The ones that are color-coded, those are regional land trusts. So you can see which counties they work in. The 4 at the bottom are statewide land trusts. They work in any county across North Carolina. Unfortunately, you see there are some holes in the map. So that is a limitation of the program. In some areas of the state, county governments are not involved in this program. Regional land trusts may not cover that area, or it may not be a priority for them at the time. So one thing that we're trying to do is to help create or build more local partners for the program, because the worst thing that we have to do is we have a landowner inquiry and they're in an area that's currently not serviced by a local partner. So we have some great resources that we're working on to build the capacity of county governments, help them get on board. So that's a constant process. But what we have seen, the most effective tool for getting county governments or land trusts on board with this process is for the landowners to speak to them directly and ask for this service. After that, we can do all we can to help convince them, so to speak, to participate in the program. So the last few slides I have, these are the last pitch. Why should you choose agricultural conservation easements? Again, the first reason is the land remains in private ownership. This is beneficial for a few reasons, both for the landowner and where these easements are located. Since they remain in private ownership, the land remains on the county tax rolls. And because these easements will allow the land to remain qualified for present use value, it's revenue neutral for the counties. Most of the applications we receive in the last cycle, 98% of the applications, they were enrolled in present use value. So since these easements allow them to remain qualified for present use value, If they're in PUV the day before the easement's recorded and they're in PUV the day after they're recorded, it's revenue neutral for counties. One of the most important tools we use in farmland preservation is cost to community services studies. These are studies that look at the revenues and expenditures of county governments related to property taxes. Most of these studies look at 3 different land uses: agricultural lands, residential lands, and commercial lands. There have been 20 of these studies completed in North Carolina, and all 20 of them say agricultural lands are net providers of tax dollars rather than net users. They give more than they receive. So another reason to keep these lands in production, because they are net providers of tax dollars. Landowners are compensated for the removal of development rights from the property. So this is a real estate transaction where you sell a particular property right, but you still maintain ownership. It's the best of both worlds. That's something that we hear very often from landowners. If it is an agricultural operation, they're not seeing a difference the day before the easement and the day after the easement. Again, we've talked about the tax incentives. One of the most common tax tools is a 1031 exchange. This is where you can use the proceeds from the purchase of the easement and use that money to buy additional property. We hear that all the time. It's a tax advantage way to do so. Now, one of the most important things that landowners need to do when they're thinking about going through this process is to speak with their lender. Because if there is a lien on the property, there has to be a payoff or a subordination agreement. The subordination agreement will state that if there is an adverse action on the property, the easement will survive that adverse action. So if the lender's not willing to subordinate, we can't go forward with the easement. So that's a very important conversation landowners have to have early on in the process. Again, this is a taxable event, so be sure to talk to your tax advisor before going into this process, or when you're in the process and you know what the values are going to be for the easement purchase, you can use those real figures to have the best situation for your taxes. But again, most often, this is what we hear. Landowners pay down their debt. They expand their operations either through the purchase of more land or equipment. But it's also a great vehicle for estate planning, setting up the next generation for the use of the property. Agricultural growth zones. This is a new program that we launched last fall. This is an effort to, on one side, get more local investments in farmland preservation. On the local side, they're able to bring in money from Raleigh to bolster their local program. What the main objective is, we want to have concentrated, conserved areas of land. There have been studies that show that when you have these large blocks of conserved land, it's one of the best tools for sprawl mitigation. It's also very important for the long-term viability of ag lands. One of the biggest threats to ag operations is the fragmentation of the landscape. When that happens, landowners have to go out further to buy or lease lands. That drives up input costs. When you have fewer operations in the area, all the support industries, agribusiness, veterinaries, those go down as well. So if we're able to have these land resources concentrated in areas, the likelihood of future success is much higher. So we're encouraging counties to think about what areas, what agricultural communities today will be the agricultural communities of tomorrow. So through this program, they're able to receive funding through our program, and they get to direct which farms are preserved. They don't have to go through a statewide competitive grant process. So more local control, more local decision-making in this process. Again, this is brand new. We're going to have our first grant contracts this fall, and we're really excited to see where this program goes. This quote is so simple, but it gets right to the heart of what we are talking about today. Food requires agriculture, agriculture requires land. North Carolina's top industry is agriculture and agribusiness. we have to have the land resources to help it maintain its top spot in North Carolina, in the North Carolina economy. It's an over $100 billion industry, but not only for the economic reasons, food security. Food security is national security. We have to have the land resources to feed ourselves, even though we feed people all across the world. And then there are great environmental benefits. We know that farmers are our best stewards of the land, and these conservation easements require conservation plans or forest management plans. So, in essence, these easements are helping to continue those good practices long into the future. We talked about impervious surfaces earlier in the presentation. If you've paid any attention to some of the events that have gone on in North Carolina in the past 5 or 6 years, weather events, we know that flooding is a tremendous concern, especially in eastern North Carolina. These easements help reduce the number of rooftops and paved surfaces. We know about the environmental benefits of ag land, and these easements just help those into the future. So this slide just kind of gives you a breakdown of all the different areas that these easements touch. Agricultural, keeping ag operations viable, helping to support our top industry in North Carolina. These great environmental benefits from keeping the land in production and in natural states. This is very much a public policy question. One of the biggest trends that have come out of this effort in the past few years has been the specific identification of agricultural lands in county land use plans. That's a great trend. It's no longer lumped in with green or open spaces. Agriculture should stand on its own in these land use plans, and that's happening more and more often. And of course, this is a quality of life issue as well. These easements help preserve our agricultural heritage, both shared and with our own families. And of course, rural viewscapes, driving through the countryside, these easements help achieve those objectives as well. So that's all I have. I know that's a lot of information, but again, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And then if anything pops up later, you have my contact information as well.
All right, thank you very much, Evan. It was a great presentation. We do have some questions, and folks, if you have questions for Evan, please click on the Q&A icon on Zoom there and enter your questions. We'd like to be able to answer those for you. The first question we got was from C. Merritt. They were wondering, they have land in Georgia. Do you know, would he be able to, or she would be able to find a similar program in Georgia?
Yeah, so again, using the American Farmland Trust as a great resource, I have connected with folks down in Georgia. I did a similar presentation to some stakeholders there. They did pass the authorization for this type of program in the past year. My understanding is they do not have funding tied to it. So that's not too uncommon. There's generally a time period where they need to set up the program, staff, rules, all that kind of stuff. But that's something that is happening. So be sure to reach out to the Georgia Department of Agriculture for information on that. The USDA programs work in all the states. So I do know that land trusts in Georgia have applied for USDA funding. So just reach out to the Georgia Department of Agriculture and they get that information for you.
All right, thank you, Evan. Next question is from Norman Pattison. What is the percentage of tax reduction for perpetual easements?
So there's a federal tax deduction that looks at your income taxes. And so it's structured in two ways. One, if you're a full-time farmer or rancher, one, if you're not. So when we looked at the breakdowns of the funding options, we'll just take the one of the pie chart where it was 180 and 180. So in that example, you would take the 180, and depending on whether or not you're a full-time farmer or not, you would then use 100% of that value or 50% of that value. And then based on your own income tax situation, there is a potential for a first year tax year and then 15 years out, the carry forward period. So you can use the whole amount. So that's generally how it works. Again, the big issue in this equation is how much your own taxes are, because it's based on income taxes. So again, another disclaimer, we don't give tax advice, but that's how it generally breaks down. Now, there are some states that have conservation tax credit. North Carolina is reintroducing their tax credit, but it's just going to be for a short amount of time, tax years 25 and 26. That tax credit is going to be 25% of the donation up to $250,000 for individuals or $500,000 for pass-through entities. So again, using that 180 example, you would then take 25% of the 180. That's the amount available for the credit. And then you'd have to file that with the Secretary of State's office. There is a statewide cap of 5 million. So, I guess we'll see how that works out. I don't know, exactly how that allocation is going to work. There might be, because of how that is broken down between the allowable uses, there could be some competition, is what I'm trying to say. So we'll provide more information once we iron out some of the details with the Department of Revenue. But that tax credit is going to be another incentive, and many other states have that as well.
All right, Evan, next question again from Norman, and he's asking, do the farmland easements require annual production of crops or livestock grazing?
So in North Carolina, easements do not have what is called affirmative agriculture language, meaning you have to farm it each year. Otherwise, there's a violation of the easement. The North Carolina easements do not have that. Frankly, that would be a very tough thing to monitor and enforce. So presumably it could grow up, but the idea is if these are perpetual conservation easements, the land resource will be available for the next owner or someone who leases it out in the future. The big thing to remember in North Carolina, if you receive 75% or more in cash considerations for the purchase of the easement, you still have to maintain your income requirement for present use value. If you receive 75% or less, these easements are eligible for permanent PUV status without regard for the income requirement. So depending on how much cash considerations you receive for the easement, it may be in your best interest to ensure you are still farming or grazing it.
Okay, one more question from Norman, and then we got some others from other folks. But Norman also wants to know what amount of money needs to be paid back if an entity wants to cancel an easement after entering into one.
I'll go ahead and tell you, it's going to be very difficult to do that. So once the easement's recorded, there's language in there that says that if agricultural productivity becomes impracticable, it could be canceled. So the only real scenario I can think of is, unfortunately, if you remember that unfortunate event in Ohio a couple of years ago where the train derailed and chemicals spilled and it turned into a brown site or Superfund site, that would really be the only situation where easement would be canceled. From a programmatic standpoint, doing so would undermine the integrity of the program. So there's really not going to be a situation where we would agree to that. And this is a common question that might be down here as well, but eminent domain. Eminent domain is a very common question with these easements, and the answer to will eminent domain impact these easements is yes and no. The yes question in a public purpose, so a road, most commonly, or a bridge, what would happen is that whatever the taking is, the amount would then be distributed back to the funding partners or the landowner who receive a tax deduction. So that's a way that an easement could be modified. But I say no because In North Carolina, there's a law that states that if we fund one of these easements, they cannot be condemned for an economic development purpose. So you have that type of protection there with these easements. But I guess I'll answer another part of this question too. If you haven't got to the point where you record the easement and the project is decided to be canceled, if there have been grant funds expended, those would have to be paid back. As I mentioned earlier, our grant contracts are with the county government or the land trust. So we'll be looking to that entity to get the grant funds back for not completing the project. But if it was the landowner's decision, then you have a situation between the landowner and that entity on what would happen next. And, again, we're not involved in that because our contract is between the state and the entity. So always be sure this is something that you want to participate in because it is a very heavy decision, either on the front side with the grant funds or for the long term with having that easement recorded on your land.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Rick. Is there a cap on the amount that the state can pay? And why does it take 3 years for NRCS to do their part?
Well, I can answer the first question, first part of that question. Last year, we did remove the cap on easement purchase. So there is no cap. Previously, it was capped at $500,000. The reason we removed it were twofold. One, we wanted to make sure that we were capturing the true real estate prices in North Carolina. If you live here, you know what's going on. So we want to make sure that we were having accurate and fair amounts for these easement purchases. The second part to that is that with a cap in place, we were having to artificially phase projects, and that might not have made the best sense for the landowner or for the land resource. So that's why we removed the cap. Again, NRCS, I can't really answer that question, but again, when you have more funding partners involved, you have their own individual review processes, so that can play into it as well. And again, we're here in Raleigh. NRCS is out of DC, and they service the entire country. So those types of delays you need to plan for those types of delays.
Okay, next question is from Julie Moore. She's wondering, how is timberland treated? Does it qualify for inclusion in agricultural easements?
So for our program, it does qualify. USDA has an open space requirement with their general ALE program. So with those, there has to be a certain amount of open space. We can work with 100% forested tracts. And in terms of how it can be treated, again, you have the right to timber harvest. If you have over 20 acres of trees, a forest management plan will be required. And so we want to make sure that those are up to date. And then it will be a matter of the landowner and the easement holding entity working on ensuring that is up to date and being followed to the best extent possible.
All right, next question is from Margell. How will the military help this program and how it affects to the people?
So again, this is something that we can work with the military on for their objectives of base encroachment protection, training area protection, and airspace protection. They want to make sure that the areas, especially where they have low-level flights, they want to reduce liability. So with the easements that we work with the military on, there are no allowances for residential construction. Again, that goes back to reducing the liability of areas where they are training. In terms of how it works for them, they have certain allowances for those funds that come from the Department of Defense for their projects. So they would submit what their plans are for 1 to 5 years. And based on how that works with their funding partners, they have those types of strategies that, again, based on location more than anything else, how that location fits into their training and operational mission.
Okay, the next question from Yonder is, what will be the specific consequences if they will not farm in a year?
No specific consequences as it relates to the easement itself. However, the consequence for landowners is qualification and eligibility for present use value, which is the agricultural land tax in North Carolina. There has to be generated income, $1,000 average over the past 3 years. And then with forestry tracts, obviously no income requirement, but compliance with forest management plans. So again, the easement, not so much, but general business operations and taxation, qualification for programs, those are real issues that landowners want to be mindful of.
All right, at this time, we have no more questions, Evan. Thank you very much for your time today and for pulling the presentation together. Leslie, do you want to talk about the next upcoming webinar?
Yes, thank you, Evan and Bob. I wanted to let you know that we'll be having our fourth quarter webinar, our final one from the year on November 21st, and it will be addressing managing bottomland hardwoods. David Merker of the University of Tennessee will be our speaker for that. So look for registration opening on that a few weeks prior to that, but go ahead and mark your calendar now, and I hope you can join us. Bob, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. This webinar today was brought to us by the North Carolina Tree Farm Program, and we do appreciate their effort to get the word out on things like easements and management on property and everything to a much broader audience than just their landowner membership, which we do appreciate. Thank you, Leslie.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everybody. That's it for today's webinar.